everyone, and welcome to Miss Estruch Biology and to this entire Topic 4 video for AQA GCSE Biology. As ever, it's a long one, so you can watch it at times 2 speed if you're watching this the night before your exam and you are pushed for time. Good luck if that is you. And if you want even more help to boost your grade, don't forget to check out in the description below my GCSE note, which cover all the theory for GCSE Biology. They've got examiner tips, key terms, definitions, summaries, questions and answers for all of the theory. But for now, enjoy the video and best of luck for your exams. So topic 4 for GCSE Biology. First of all, an overview of this topic, because this is the one that explores how plants and animals obtain and use energy. So we'll be looking at how plants photosynthesize, and we'll be looking at how both plants and animals are going to respire. And in fact, all living things respire, and they can respire aerobically and anaerobically. But we'll be looking at in animals the buildup of lactic acid in muscles and the effect of exercise. So let's get into the main content, starting with photosynthesis. This is a process by which plants make glucose using light energy. And because they're taking in energy, that is why it's an endothermic reaction, meaning energy is absorbed from the surroundings. And the way it can take in energy is, in the cells there are organelles or subcellular structures known as chloroplasts, and these contain a green pigment called chlorophyll, which is able to absorb the light energy. That light energy is then used in this reaction, and you do need to know both the word equation and also the chemical equation. So these would be good to turn into flashcards. You could have one flashcard showing the word equation and another showing the chemical equation. Now you don't actually have to write light energy within the equation like this. It often goes over the top of the arrow, like you can see in the image here. Also, if you are new to my entire topic videos, just to let you know, the yellow highlights indicates key marking points. So throughout all of this, look out for those key marking points you should be including in your answers. So you then also need to know about the rate of photosynthesis. You can't be up here. Down you get. We've already said one of the key marking points is it's an endothermic reaction, meaning it needs energy taken in for the reaction to occur, but it is also an enzyme-controlled reaction. And for that reason, there are certain factors that will speed up or slow down the rate of photosynthesis. One of those is temperature. Light intensity also has an impact because light energy is required for this reaction to occur. Carbon dioxide is one of the reactants, so that is going to have an impact as well. Also the amount of chlorophyll, because that absorbs the light energy. So let's go through each of those in a bit more detail. So if it came up in an exam, you could explain why each of those factors affects the rate of photosynthesis, and you could describe how. So light intensity, and it is key that you say intensity, because that is referring to a bit like the idea of quantity of light, but we don't say quantity, we say intensity instead. Light energy provides the energy needed for photosynthesis. Therefore, if the light intensity increases, that means you've got more energy for the reaction, and the rate of photosynthesis will therefore increase. But you can get to the point where if you increase the light intensity anymore, it doesn't have an impact anymore, because unless you also have optimum temperature and enough CO2, you can't increase the reaction any further. Carbon dioxide then, this is one of the reactants. We saw that in the word equation. So if you add more of that reactant, the rate of reaction can happen faster. But again, that's only going to happen up to a set point, because beyond that, you might have plenty of carbon dioxide, but not enough light intensity and light energy for that reaction. Then temperature. This links to enzymes, because if you don't have a high enough temperature, then there's not enough kinetic energy for those enzymes to form enzyme substrate complexes. And if the temperature is too high, that will denature enzymes. So again, you won't have the enzyme substrate complexes, and that can cause the rate of reaction to drop to 0. Lastly, the amount of chlorophyll. That is the green coloured pigment inside of the chloroplasts. So if you have more of that, there's more chlorophyll to absorb the light energy needed for photosynthesis. And this links to topic 3, plant disease, because if plants don't have enough magnesium ions to make chlorophyll, then their leaves go yellow, and that's going to affect the rate of photosynthesis. Now, this is one of the required practicals, looking at how factors affect photosynthesis. But in this video, I'm just going through the theory, but this is just to point this out, that you can use this apparatus below to go through how to measure the rate of photosynthesis is affected by different variables. And in this one, we could look at how light intensity affects the rate. So we can see we've got our setup. Our pond would be photosynthesizing. The water bath is to control the temperature. And we could measure the volume of oxygen produced over a period of time when the lamp is at different distances away, and that's how it would be varying the light intensity. Now, this bit is for higher tier only, and this is going into what I was talking about a bit more on the previous slides, where we were saying when you get to a certain point when the light intensity is still increased but the rate levels off, this is the concept of limiting factors. So any of the four factors, light intensity, carbon dioxide, temperature, or chlorophyll, may be the limiting factor at a given time. And what we mean by limiting factor is that is what is currently limiting or slowing the rate of reaction. And the limiting factor on these three graphs is always where you have this directly proportional relationship, because as we increase the light intensity, the rate is increasing. So that means the light intensity is what is limiting it. But where we see the rate plateauing or leveling off, that must mean that something else is now limiting the rate. Because even though we're increasing the light intensity still, the rate isn't getting any higher. So at that point, the limiting factor must be either carbon dioxide concentration or temperature. Same idea here on the carbon dioxide graph. At this point where we've got that positive correlation, as we increase the carbon dioxide concentration, the rate of photosynthesis increases. And that means that carbon dioxide is the limiting factor at that point. But where we see the rate leveling off or plateauing, even though we're increasing the carbon dioxide concentration, the rate isn't increasing, so there now must be another factor limiting the rate of photosynthesis. So it could be light intensity or temperature. This graph isn't so much to do limiting factors. I mean, it is at this point here, because we've still got the positive correlation. As you increase temperature, the rate of photosynthesis increases. That is a limiting factor at this point, the temperature. But we have a difference because the rate drops off rather than leveling off. And the reason the rate decreases is at that point, the temperature is now so high that the enzymes that are involved in photosynthesis must have denatured. Now, I've actually already talked through all of this, but if you want to pause so you can make notes and write it down or turn it into a flashcard, this is the information that I was just talking through to describe and explain the light intensity limiting factors graph and the carbon dioxide. And then on the next slide, we have the one for temperature. Next slide is also for higher tier only, still linked to limiting factors, and it's knowing that greenhouse growers and farmers, they will use this concept of limiting factors to try and maximise their yield, which means the quantity of plant they are producing. And if they're producing more plants, that means they have more profit if that is what they're selling. So they will need to consider, is it worth them paying for lighting, so that's electricity, to increase the amount of plant growth and therefore what they have available to sell. So essentially, they have to see what costs them more, the lighting, and therefore you get more profit, or will they actually get more money if they don't pay for lighting and they have slightly less to sell? It depends how much the lighting is going to cost. Same idea if they're paying to heat it up, to increase the temperature, or if they're paying for paraffin, which is a fuel you can burn, which will also increase the temperature, but it makes carbon dioxide also. So it's all to do with working out, is it worth paying for the extra? You've got to balance that out to see, is it cost beneficial or cost efficient? Next bit is also higher tier, and it's the concept of the inverse square law. So light intensity decreases as the distance from a light source increases. So this links to that required practical. As you move the lamp, which is your light source, further away, the light intensity will decrease. And this relationship follows what's known as the inverse square law, which is this formula here, that light intensity is proportional to 1 over distance squared. So that is what you need to know, the formula. And what this means is that if the distance between a plant and the light source is doubled, the light intensity reduces to 1/4. And this diagram is visually representing that. So we're now moving back to content that is for foundation and for higher. And that is, what is the glucose used for that is created in photosynthesis? So number one, some of that glucose can be converted into starch and it's stored for later use. Some of that glucose is used to produce fats and oils, which again can be stored. Most of the glucose is used for respiration. Some of it is used to produce amino acids, which can then combine with nitrate ions absorbed from the soil to create amino acids and proteins. Some of it is used to make cellulose, which is what we find in the plant cell walls to provide structural strength. We then move on to a respiration. So this is the other chemical reaction that you need to learn about. And this chemical reaction occurs in all living organisms to release energy that is needed for metabolism. This time it's an exothermic reaction, which means when the reaction happens, it releases energy or transfers energy to the surroundings. Respiration is essential because of that energy that is being released, because the energy is needed for building larger molecules, for example, protein synthesis, making those proteins from the amino acids. It's needed for movement, because when your muscles contract and relax, it is using energy. And keeping you warm as well, because to maintain a constant body temperature in mammals and birds, you need to respire to release energy. Some of that energy will be heat energy. Now, one key thing I do want to point out as a really important examiner tip here is, throughout this slide, you'll notice I say release energy, transfer energy. At no point is it create or produce energy, because you cannot make new energy. You can only release or transfer it. So it's really important you don't ever say produce or make energy. It is releasing the energy. There are two types of respiration. Aerobic. This is the type that uses oxygen and it releases more energy because it can fully break down glucose. And then anaerobic respiration. This is the type that doesn't use oxygen, but it releases less energy because glucose isn't fully broken down. So let's have a look at those two in more detail. Aerobic, we said this is the type of respiration occurring when oxygen is available. It completely breaks down glucose and therefore it releases large amounts of energy. You need to know the word equation and also the chemical equation for this, just like with photosynthesis. And one thing you might notice is it is the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis was water plus carbon dioxide goes to oxygen and glucose. Aerobic respiration is the opposite. It's glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water, and that releases energy. For the chemical equation, I didn't actually say this for photosynthesis, but it's the same concept because this is the reverse of photosynthesis. In terms of balancing, you do have to be able to balance it. This is your chemical formula for glucose, but all of the other molecules, so oxygen, carbon dioxide and water, to balance it, you put a 6 in front of those three. So it's 6, 6, 6. That's how you balance these equations. So key features of aerobic respiration. We've said it's the type of respiration that releases energy using oxygen. It releases more energy. It produces carbon dioxide and water as waste products. And it occurs in the mitochondria of the cells. So that's specifically where aerobic respiration happens. Now let's move on to anaerobic respiration in humans. So anaerobic respiration occurs when there's not enough oxygen available, but you still have to respire because energy is required for that whole list that we talked about earlier. But basically you need energy for all chemical reactions. And if you're doing intense exercise, you are probably not going to be able to get oxygen into your body and to all of the cells fast enough to be able to continue to respire aerobically. And that's why anaerobic respiration begins, because you still need energy, but you don't have enough oxygen available. And that will then result in oxygen being partially broken down. The word equation for this is really short. Glucose is partially broken down, and the only product is lactic acid. This does release some energy, but we don't put energy in the word equation because it's not a product. We haven't produced it. It's just released. You don't need to know the chemical formula for this one. So key features of anaerobic respiration in humans is no oxygen is required, less energy is released, and that's because glucose is not fully broken down. Lactic acid is produced, which is actually toxic, and that acid can start to cause your muscles to fatigue, which means they're not going to work anymore. And that's because the lactic acid, as the name suggests, is an acid, and that will start to denature enzymes, and that affects whether the muscles can contract and relax. So when that lactic acid does build up in the muscles when you're doing intense exercise, that's why you can get muscle cramps or your muscles feel like they're tired. And even though you're telling your arm to continue to contract when you're doing bicep curls or push-ups, whatever it might be, your body just won't do it anymore. And that's because the muscles are fatigued and they physically cannot contract and relax anymore because of that lactic acid. So after exercise, oxygen is needed to break down that harmful lactic acid, and it breaks it back down in the liver into carbon dioxide and water, so it's no longer harmful and your muscles can recover. And that's known as the oxygen debt, which I'll be going into in more detail for higher tier in a future slide. Anaerobic respiration in plants and yeast is slightly different. It's still when you have incomplete breakdown of glucose, and it's when you don't have oxygen present. But because plants and yeast, which is an example of a fungus, have different enzymes to animals, you get different products. So for both types of anaerobic respiration in plants and yeast and also in animals, you need to know the word equation, but not the chemical equation. And this process is known as fermentation when it's happening in yeast. So key features then. First of all, you produce ethanol, which is a type of alcohol, and carbon dioxide, and this is instead of lactic acid. Because it's making ethanol, this is what is used to make alcoholic drinks. So you would do fermentation, which means allowing yeast to respire without oxygen, and it will produce ethanol, which is used to make alcoholic drinks. It's also used in the production of bread, because that is going to be harnessing that idea of the carbon dioxide to make the bread expand. So this here actually just goes through that in a little bit more detail. So the bread making, the yeast respires anaerobically, that releases the carbon dioxide and makes the dough rise, which is a better word than saying bread expand. The dough is rising. And alcohol production, we've got the ethanol is produced by that fermentation process, and that's used to make beer and wine, the alcoholic drinks. We then move on to the next part of the spec for topic 4, which is response to exercise. During exercise, your body needs more energy because your muscles are contracting and relaxing, and to do that, they require more energy. So to supply this extra energy, the rate of respiration has to increase. And if you're respiring more, the body responds in several ways to ensure that your respiring cells are being provided with sufficient oxygen, so aerobic respiration can continue, and also glucose, because that is one of the reactants. So the first change that we see is your heart rate increases. And the reason your heart starts to beat faster is that means more blood is going to be transported around your body. And if that blood has got glucose and oxygen in it, that means you're supplying your respiring cells with more glucose and oxygen. It also means that the waste products like carbon dioxide and potentially lactic acid are being removed from the cells more rapidly as well. The next thing is your breathing rate also increases. So you're breathing, ventilating, breathing in and out faster, and that's so that you get more oxygen diffusing in and more carbon dioxide diffusing out of the alveoli. Your breathing volume also increases, which means you're taking deeper breaths. And that's so that a larger volume of air is inhaled into your lungs, so that more oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into your bloodstream. So all three of these changes are to try and ensure that aerobic respiration can continue for as long as possible. However, sometimes that is not going to be the case, because if your body cannot supply enough oxygen, despite all of those increases and changes that we just saw, then anaerobic respiration will start to occur in your muscles. And as we said, this is the incomplete breakdown of glucose. You get less energy, you get lactic acid, and as that builds up, it can cause muscle fatigue and pain, and that's what stops the muscles contracting as efficiently. This next bit is for higher tier only, and it's going into more detail about the oxygen debt. So after that vigorous exercise where aerobic respiration wasn't able to continue because you didn't have sufficient oxygen being supplied to your cells, you get what's known as an oxygen debt. And extra oxygen is needed to be taken in, so gas exchange where you have the oxygen from the alveoli diffusing into the blood. You need to get more oxygen so that you can break down the lactic acid so it can be removed from the body. Now, lactic acid is broken down in the liver, and it gets to the liver from those respiring cells in the blood. So that blood transports the lactic acid to the liver, and at that point in the liver, if you have enough oxygen coming in, it can break down lactic acid back to glucose. And the amount of oxygen that is needed to break down all of that lactic acid after exercise is known as the oxygen debt. So basically, the body repays this oxygen debt by continuing to breathe heavily and more rapidly even after you've stopped exercising. And that's what we can see here in the graph. At rest, we can see the oxygen consumption is lower. You start exercising and the oxygen consumption is increasing. It then reaches the maximum that you're able to consume. After exercise, this bit here is the oxygen debt, the extra oxygen that is required to break down the lactic acid, and then at this point you've recovered and gone back to your at-rest state. The final bit of this topic is metabolism. And metabolism, this is a key definition, is the sum of all chemical reactions happening within a cell or within an organism. And all of these chemical reactions are enzyme controlled, and they allow your body to either build or break down molecules as they need. The energy for these reactions comes from respiration. So let's have a look at some of the examples then of these synthesis reactions, which means the reaction's building molecules. It could be building carbohydrates. So glucose that has come from digestion and then you've absorbed it could be converted into a larger molecule, glycogen. Or if it's to do with lipids, so fats and oils, you absorb glycerol and fatty acids from digestion. Those could be converted into lipids that are used for energy storage, insulation and cell membrane. And then lastly, it could be making proteins from amino acids. So the other set of reactions are those that involve breaking down molecules. And respiration is an example of that because glucose is being broken down to release energy. You can also have proteins being broken down when urea is being formed. So any excess proteins, they actually can't be stored. So they're broken down in the liver into urea, which then gets excreted. And that excretion happens via the kidneys. So that is it for topic 4. Pause and have a go at these 10 end of topic questions to test that you have understood all the information. And if there's any that you don't get right, then go back and watch that bit of the video again. So pause, have a go. I'm going to go straight on to the next slide, which shows you the answers now. So here are the answers. Have a go at marking them and see how you did. And like I said, go over them again if you need to. So if you did find that helpful, particularly the emphasis of key marking points, key terms and examiner's tips, then head to the description because I have my full GCSE notes which go through key terms, key marking points, and there are examiner's tips of what you should and shouldn't do to make sure you get the top marks. As well as at the end of every topic, there's a different set of 10 questions with the answers, different to the ones that you see in these videos. But that is it for today. Hopefully you found it helpful, and I'll see you in a video soon.